Pardon? 2? Is it 2? 1? I don't know what that means. Okay, the question is, they're here. Okay? Now, given they're here, there is, suppose, a right that's given to each of them to emit some amount of pollution. Okay? So what's not shown on this graph is the complement of the amount that they're abating, right? So in a pollution rights trading world, one of them, for example, who's more efficient than the other, can, in effect, sell pollution rights to the less efficient firm. And when it sells efficient rights to the less efficient firm, it's going to do less abatement, right? Itself. Okay? Now, does that help? Okay? What's the answer? We're here. We're right here. A, let's call them 1 and 2. This is 1. This is 2. Yeah, you're quite right. With regard to 1, you're at A. That's the cost that they're incurring for the 8. And for the 7, firm 2 is at C. That's its marginal cost. So its marginal cost at C is much higher than the marginal cost for 1 at A. Right? You're moving in the right direction. I can feel it. Firm 1 would buy? They would get your permits? Now, I understand this is worth thinking about. It is a complicated graph, and that's because you've got this simultaneity going on between the two firms. Go ahead, give Omega a hand.
Oh, okay, well, basically, firm 1 would want to sell two of their credits to firm 2.
Yes.
But I have a question. So
well, no, you finish that. You finish that logic.
Oh, okay, well, they would want to do that, and then firm 2 would want to buy them because that would significantly lower their cost of abatement?
Exactly. So they would continue to do that. There would be a benefit of the bargain. That process would continue to unfold all the way to this point. And at that point, there would be no incentive for them to trade permits anymore, right? Now, what's your question?
Well, doesn't that raise the cost of firm 1 from A to B? So where's their incentive in selling?
Oh, but when they sell, there's going to be a market clearing price for the permit.
Okay.
That's their incentive, right?
Okay, so that just has to be greater.
Right. So right away, it turns out that the willingness to pay on the part of the second firm is what marginal cost they can avoid.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Makes sense? There's a lot going on behind this graph. But keep it in mind, think it through, make sure that you understand the fundamental logic, all right? Yes?
So you create this graph by, you got to establish a certain cap, in this case 15, right? So you make 15
Yes.
units,
Yes.
and then you draw it both directions, graph it up to your end, and then that's how you create this, this image.
Yes. The whole point here is lying behind this, going back to about 15 or 20 minutes ago in the lecture, the amount of abatement that the public sector is seeking is 15 units. Right. Yes?
So, is it the area difference between us, the rectangle C and rectangle B, is equal to pi, that source scale?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Now, I'm going to jump across this, and we'll come back to everything we've done up till now is for uniformly mixed pollution. And for the case of non-point pollution, it becomes much more complicated. We're going to look at that again and again in the context of particular natural resources. But given the time we have left today, I'm going to move on to food and agriculture. Okay. For your readings on the syllabus, this is referred to as agriculture. And this also is the foundation for the panel discussion that's going to occur on Thursday evening. By the way, who can tell me who Malthus is? Lily. Speak up, I'm sorry. You're not shy. I've been there with you. You're not shy. Speak up. Right. That's the Malthusian hypothesis about food consumption, food production, and ultimately what would happen. And when did he write, Lily? Roughly. Just give me the century. Yes. Okay, so that's fundamentally what is the hypothesis of food scarcity. It's sourced with Malthusian. A Malthusian lens on the world. And what's changed that is technological progress. Now, another question we want to analyze, why is there overproduction in developed countries? And developed countries, you may question why, in public discourse, thought leaders refer to the United States as a developed country. But nevertheless, that's how they define it. And that's to draw a differentiation between developing or less developed countries or emerging market countries in contrast to developed or industrialized countries. And why is there underproduction in developing or least developed countries? What are the environmental costs, the external costs associated with agricultural production? Who bears those costs? What are the sources of inefficiency in agriculture and food production? And what are the impacts of current public policies in agriculture? Those are the questions, along with whether or not current public policies provide the foundation for sustainability. Okay. Let's first look at the global scarcity hypothesis, which we can dismiss in short order. And this comes back to what Lily just said. Namely, according to Malthus, you have exponential growth in the population. And it turns out that the basic resources for agricultural production, land, is fixed. Hence, at some point in time, you're going to reach a point where there isn't sufficient production to feed the population. And as a result, that lens gives you the outcome that ultimately there will be global food scarcity. Now, there are two forms of this hypothesis. One is a strong form that predicts that per capita food production will decline steadily over time. And the second, a weaker form of the hypothesis, is that the price of food will continue to increase relative to the price of all other goods, both of which are false. What do you suppose the total food expenditure was for an average person in society at the year 1901? What percentage of their total expenditures was devoted to food, roughly? Yes, a little more than half, actually. What do you suppose it is today? A little more than 10%. But a huge difference, right? A very large difference. And moreover, in real terms, coming back to the time value of money that we discussed, discount rates, and we also discussed real values of variables, if you look at the real price of food in this country over the last 100 years, in real terms, it's steadily declined. All right. What's missing in both of these hypotheses is technological progress. Improvements in machinery, genetic engineering, GMOs, which some people are adverse to, but nevertheless it's certainly improved productivity. And they've also made food production more resistant to diseases, pests, and use various inputs to control what would otherwise lead to lower productivity. All right? And there's been huge increases in yields. Land has become much more productive, and there have been periods within the last 50 or so years where there's been massive surpluses that have emerged, for which there has not been sufficient demand to actually consume the available amount of production. So, in the final analysis, technological progress has increased food production much faster than population, and per capita production, in terms of the entire population, has also increased. And here is a specific set of facts, namely, world agriculture globally produces 17% more calories per person today than it did 30 years ago, even though the world population has increased by 70% over the same period. Right? Hence, both of the hypotheses, whether in the strong form or the weak form, at least based on empirical evidence, should be rejected. Having said that, why are so many people hungry? Those numbers I just gave you were gross numbers. It doesn't say anything about the distribution of food. In fact, over the last 100 years, at any point in time, if you look at the total production of food, there was more than sufficient food to alleviate any hunger in the world. So it's a maldistribution problem, right? That is to say, the food isn't finding its way to those who find themselves in pockets of poverty, and as a result, there is frequent episodes of starvation, even though, in the aggregate, there's ample food to mitigate against that possible outcome. Now, it also turns out that in those countries that have the income levels to be able to not only incur the price, whatever the price might be for food, because of their sufficient income, in those countries, too, is where all the overproduction is taking place. And in contrast, in those countries where there isn't sufficient income and there's significant hunger, in those countries, there is underproduction. And you stop and ask yourself, gee whiz, why does that happen? It must have something to do with the endowment. That is to say, the land resources, the skills, the human capital that exist in those countries. And that would be a reasonable hypothesis, but you could reject it because it's not factually supported. What is factually supported is that the policies in developed countries versus developing countries, in one case, the policies are designed to result in overproduction, and in the developing countries, their policies do just the opposite. Okay, let's look at that. Let's take first, why does overproduction occur in developed countries? It turns out that much of our public policy offers direct subsidization to production of food. And moreover, the external cost that results from that production is not borne by the party who generates those external costs. Specifically, water pollution, soil erosion, discharge of chemicals and fertilizers. None of those costs, generally, there's exceptions along the way, and it's changing as the past few decades have unfolded and will continue to change. But generally speaking, the producers of food do not bear these external costs. And as a result, the private benefits from that subsidization accrue to the producers or the sellers of food or the farmers. And this comes through many different policies. Subsidized water prices, crop price guarantees, deficiency payments, export enhancement programs. A host of different policies are out there, all of which create incentives for overproduction. What happens in developing countries? Now, there's exceptions to these general observations, but they hold for the majority of the countries. In the case of developing countries, or less developed countries, particularly in those countries that have questionable governance structures. What do I mean by questionable governance structures? Those countries that have dictatorial regimes, or those countries who have non-democratic regimes. Think about Egypt over the course of the last 30 years. Now, what happens in those countries is that no totalitarian regime or dictator wants to be faced with an urban population that doesn't have enough to eat. Right? So how do they proceed with regard to their public policies? They proceed by subsidizing the price of food to the ultimate consumers. But when they subsidize the price of food, they end up paying lower prices to those who are producing the food. And this is illustrated here with regard to two institutional mechanisms that are out there that are used by many developing countries. For a particular commodity, rice, for example, a staple item in much of the world, there are marketing boards that were established historically. The marketing boards go out and aggregate all the supply, pay a price to the producer, and then turn around and move or sell that product to consumers in urban populations. And they do so at prices below the economic value of that food. So as a result, the marketing boards, which are generally speaking accounting boards aside from the corruption and crony capitalism that takes place in some of these countries, they end up returning a smaller payment to the producers of those food. And it creates disincentive for them to adopt the new technology. It creates disincentive for them to expand their production. And these countries frequently have problems with regard to collecting taxes to support governmental expenditures. And what they do is they use their agricultural sector, they tax it, particularly with regard to exports, because they're easily measured because it moves outside the border of the country, and thus they can come along and tax it and use that as a revenue source for running the government. Right? And with those export taxes, it reduces the amount of foreign demand and results in another causal force for still lower prices and lower incomes for farmers involved in food production. Okay, so that's a broad overview of why, in the case of developed countries, you have overproduction, and for developing or less developed countries, you have underproduction. Now, let's turn to the environmental cost. one cost from overutilizing the available land resources. If you provide huge subsidies, it shouldn't surprise us that there's going to be depletion and over-exploitation of whatever resources are available. And one of the sources of that exploitation is soil erosion. And that leads to externalities associated with increased sediment in reservoirs and streams, loss in the value of recreational resources, and ultimately a reduction in the long-term productivity of land. Now, for those of you who are thinking deeply, you're going to say to yourself, wait a minute, why isn't maintaining the quality of land, why isn't that internalized if a farmer has a property right on the quality of that land, right? If that farmer has exclusivity, transferability, everything that we specified in terms of the 3 basic conditions, if a farmer has all those things, why aren't they the best shepherd of maintaining the quality and the productivity of that land, not just today, but well into the future? Sounds reasonable, right? If all of those potential costs are internalized, that should take place. However, the counter incentives is if the government comes along and offers huge subsidies today to overexploit that resource, then there is going to be less, I hesitate to use the word, intertemporal trade-off between productivity of land today versus productivity of land 10 years from now. Okay. Continuing with the environmental cost, or external cost and environmental cost. Now I'm just explaining what I just said in a different way. They don't, for example, receive compensation for conservation benefits. However, as part of the discussion that's going to take place on Thursday, the U.S. government, this is hard to believe, but for the last 5 years, the U.S. government spent on agriculture and food programs in the United States $400 billion. So it's a big business. And the government is actively involved all the way from the individual farmer and the amount that they produce all the way through the supply chain up to the consumption of food by each and every one of us. And moreover, the programs that exist with respect to those portions of the population that are at risk with regard to hunger and poverty. Okay? But in any event, the environmental costs, the external costs are undeniable, and they've been fully documented. And what the government, because it provides so much in the way of incentives to overutilize the land, what the government has done is come along and said to individual producers, you can have access to our subsidies if and only if you idle some portion of your land resources. It's called set-asides, or idling land. So to get access to the subsidies, they have to idle some portion of their land. So what now is the incentives for individual farmers given they have to idle some portion of their land? They can't use the land input, so they'll use other inputs. They'll overutilize other inputs, pesticides, fertilizers, and create more in the way of external cost and more erosion than would otherwise take place. Make sense? You all with me? Okay. All right. Continuing with the external cost, I've already referred to the intensified use of chemicals and fertilizers, and these kind of externalities that ultimately emerge with regard to health risk is levels of nitrates in drinking water, for example. The contamination that takes place from herbicides and pesticides that has an adverse effect not only on humans, but also the normal population of fish. The phosphorus levels, and fertilizer in particular, have an adverse effect on algae in terms of the normal cycle that has adverse effects on the amount of oxygen that's available. Okay, so those are a quick overview of the kind of environmental cost, and part of this $400 billion that I referred to, a small part of that $400 billion, also tries to create incentives for conservation reserves, where individual producers can, in effect, retire their land, or land for which they hold the property right, and get compensated by the government for doing so. Okay. Now, why do they use chemicals? I've already explained that. It's in part because of the relative prices. If the government comes along and says, you will receive this subsidy if and only if you idle a portion of your land resources, they, the individual farmers or producers, respond by using other cheaper inputs, pesticides, chemicals, and to show what the effect is of this kind of substitution, or what drives this substitution, that's a better characterization, is the following graphs in which I have reported to you what happens to the real price of pesticides versus other kinds of inputs, machinery, or the price of pesticides versus fuel or energy. Over the period for the data that I reported here, 1965 through 1990, you can see that it steadily declined. So the incentives now that are engineered through the marketplace is to apply more pesticides than the alternative with regard to other inputs that are out there. Likewise, if you look at the price of pesticides versus labor and or the price of pesticides versus the output price of the product that producers or farmers are selling, once again, over that same period of time, it steadily declined. That creates more incentive to use these inputs that are not only a source of increasing production, but also a source for more externalities. Now, let's look at the form of the kind of subsidization that takes place. And by the way, the subsidization in U.S. agriculture and food production began in the 1930s, during the first Roosevelt administration. And it began in large part because the overall economy was largely an agrarian economy, number one, and number two, people were suffering. And what the government came along and did, and this may strike you as a bit of a surprise. Remember when we were talking about monopolies versus well-functioning